Thanks so much. Hey, can you hear me all right? Yep. Okay, great. Thanks so much to Joseph Lemach and the Center for Mark Twain Studies for the invitation to participate in the Trouble Begins lecture series this spring, and also to Matt Sable for putting my name forward for this opportunity. I actually started writing about Pudd'nhead Wilson in graduate school at Cornell University, where I worked with Shirley Samuels, who happens to be a Quarry Fellow this year. And I've been happy to visit the house with my family this week. They're in the back. Say hey. So hey to my son Ezra is reading something else that is not my talk, and my parents and my partner are here. I'm from this area of upstate New York, born and raised in Syracuse, and so it's very much a region that is home to me. It's nice to be here and to see the lovely views from the hills. I'm gonna get this clicker. So my talk comes from the first chapter, from a chapter of my first book, Relative Races, Genealogies of Interracial Kinship in 19th Century America. And this book's main project is unpacking the construction of race. Race is relative. It's created not only in genealogies of racial descent, but also in the spaces of racialized interpersonal relationships. And this is something that Twain's novel shows. This chapter takes up the phenomenon by which kinship is recognized or denied in genealogies that reproduce race, showing how race gets created beyond these lines of inheritance. Twain's 1894 novel, Pudd'nhead Wilson, is interesting, I think, for the slippages it produces between these two different forms of racialized maternity, the figure of the mother and the figure of the mammy. So although the term mammy has been historically used sometimes as a familiar synonym for mother, by the mid-19th century in the United States, this word had a clearly racialized meaning, and it departed from designating biological motherhood. Most prominently, it came to refer to enslaved Black women whose forced labor involved working as caregivers and also, importantly, as wet nurses to the white children of their enslavers. And the popular imagining of a Black woman caring for her enslavers' children was an inherently pro-slavery image, one designed to create this fiction of enslaved people as part of a happy white-dominated family. And the image of the mammy erases those realities of violence, both sexual violence and otherwise, to which enslaved women were subjected when they worked in such close proximity with enslavers. It also conspicuously erases Black women's own kin. Enslaved Black women were forced to wean their own babies in order to nurse the children of their enslavers, to prioritize caring for the latter, even while their own children were many times sold away from them. Coupled with minstrel versions of the mammy in popular cultural representations and in literature, this is an inherently derogatory figure that has also been the single most prominent representation of Black women in US literature and popular culture. And so among this complex array of factors, I point to the mammy as a maternal figure, not only a figure who is maternal in her relation to white children, but also bears relation to her own children. And the erasure of Black children from images like these hold within them that violence of familial separation under slavery. The mammy is not just a caregiver for white children, but she's an enslaved mother, and a mother who has no legal relationship to the children that she bears. We can read a version of this condition of enslaved motherhood in a poem by Frances Ellen Watkins Harper from 1854 called The Slave Mother, in which the narrator describes how slavery threatens relationships between enslaved women and children. He is not hers, although she bore him for another's pains. He is not hers, although her blood is coursing through her veins. He is not hers, for cruel hands may rudely tear apart the only wreath of household love that binds her breaking heart. And so Harper's poem illustrates the condition of enslaved motherhood as burdened by this contradictory cross-purpose of mother love and slavery's maternal inheritance, right? Children inherited the enslaved status of their mothers regardless of their father's paternity. And enslaved motherhood is complicated by the fact of this reproductive labor, but also complicated by other forms of maternal labor into which enslaved women were forced, specifically working as wet nurses and caregivers to other people's children, the children of their enslavers. And so I'm particularly interested in narratives in which enslaved women's roles as mothers is not simply subsumed, erased by their role of caregivers to white children, because here the necessity of the mother for forming the figure of the mammy becomes visible. And Pudd'nhead Wilson is one story where we see that dual role of the mother and the mammy. So motherhood and mammyhood are both racialized and racializing kinship relationships in this novel. These are relationships through which race is inherited and in which race is performed. And there are also relationships in which either the kinship, usually of biological motherhood, or the ersatz, the kinship, the faux kinship of mammyhood, are defined by racial identification and difference. And so I want to hear, I lost my place for a second. Okay, so I want to hear kind of highlight the coupling of those different kinds of kinship, right? Biological kinship and that ersatz, that fake kinship, by which I very much don't mean the kind of fictive kinship that we often associate with enslaved people's cultural, relational practices of kinship with other enslaved people who aren't necessarily their biological kin. This is something different. Now, many enslaved people were, of course, biologically related to their enslavers, but the history of slavery tells us that some kinship relationships matter more than others. So although most white 19th century authors presented caricatured versions of Black women, particularly in this figure of the mammy, Black authors, and especially Black women authors, have complicated these images with depictions of Black maternity and caregiving. And we see this in a wide variety of figures, from autobiographical writers like Sojourner Truth and Harriet Jacobs, to fiction by Black authors like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, the author of that slave mother poem, Julia Collins, Pauline Hopkins, and later writers, we can see this too in the prominent writing of people like Toni Morrison. But in Pudd'nhead Wilson, in this very odd novel by Twain, we also see a kind of similar complex coupling of the mammy and the mother, the revelation of these figures as interrelated. So a woman named Roxy is at the center of this novel, and she is both the mammy and mother in Twain's novel. She challenges the barriers of kinship and racial relations as she shifts between performing both of these roles to the same child in this, the same children in this novel. So as a mother and a mammy, Roxy's own mixed race representation is employed also to reflect on the ambiguity of these maternal relationships, challenging assumptions of biological motherhood. Because both Roxy and these children appear racially similar, we can see how those relations kind of play out. And we see here how the children's racialization is enacted not only through biological kinship, but in a kind of simultaneity of genealogical motherhood as it exists alongside this odd ersatz kinship relationship of mammyhood. So Roxy is the enslaved mother of valet de chambre and mammy to Tom and Abesket Driscoll, the children of her enslaver. And she illustrates how these genealogies of racialization get complicated by these relationships. As a racially mixed woman who is able to simultaneously embody both the mother and the mammy roles to either of these children, her shifting performance of motherhood and mammyhood throughout the novel enacts these racial genealogies for the children in her care. Scholar Kimberly Wallace Sanders observes that, quote, neither Roxy is not a stereotypical mammy figure, and argues further that she falls into a uniquely hybrid stereotype that I'll call the mixed race mammy. Though this is insufficient for kind of understanding what is happening in Twain's text. Roxy, like other mid to late century mixed race characters, like in novels by Harriet Beecher Stowe, Eliza Harris, or in William Wells Brown's novels, we can see she embodies the contradictions of a race-based system of slavery that doesn't reflect the realities of racial mixture and ambiguity, which are themselves a direct result of this patriarchal plantation system. And Twain's narrator ruminates on this contradiction of Roxy's race throughout Pudd'nhead Wilson. She's a white-presenting person who is nevertheless enslaved. And we read there that Roxy's child was, quote, 31 parts white to what Twain calls, by fiction of law and custom, a Negro. And Twain's playing with this idea of how race is made. And his narrator doesn't seem to entirely convinced that either Roxy or her child are really Negroes, as Twain says, but the plot depends upon the notion that there are black people and there are white people, and that some people are enslavable and other people aren't. The fiction of law and custom that Twain cites here as the process of race making that we all call in other contexts racial formation. In this fiction, called hypodescent, or sometimes called the one-drop rule, is no less emphatic in its racializing capacity because it departs from ideas of these quantums of racialized blood, 32 parts or whatever Twain says, but because it departs from our normal models of racialization. But Twain makes his readers aware of the social means by which Roxy's race is constructed, and also how she works to construct the race of these children. Like other mammy figures, Roxy's mammy to one child and mother to another, nursing and rearing the child of her enslaver alongside, and even instead of her own. But the two children that Roxy tends seem to be virtually identical, and they're indistinguishable from one another by anyone other than Roxy herself, their primary caregiver. Now, Roxy's relation to and unique knowledge of these children is the thing that allows her to then switch the children's places, which is what we see in this illustration here. Switching the boys' identities, and also therefore their racialization, just by virtue of her own relationship to them. Her position as mother to one child and mammy to the other enacts that racialization in relative terms. And so initially, at least, it is through these children's respective relationships to Roxy that each child then assumes his identity as either white and free or black and enslaved. And these effective shifts in identity challenge these notions of kinship through which racial identity is inherited genealogically, passed down from mother to children. Roxy's shifting between the roles of mother and mammy illustrates how she simultaneously performs and interpolates not only her own, but others' racialization. She makes race for these children through these roles in their attending racial genealogies. So as a white-looking woman who might be able to pass for white were it not for her racially marked dialect in the novel, Roxy's very existence calls into question the antebellum beliefs about racial dualism and essentialism, how race is made and how it operates under slavery. The first glimpse we get of Roxy easily dispatches with those clearly understood markers of blackness and whiteness, as Twain tells us that from Roxy's manner of speech, a stranger would have expected her to be black, but she was not. Only 1/16 of her was black, and that 16th did not show. She was of majestic form and stature. Her attitudes were imposing and statuesque, her gestures and movements distinguished by noble and stately grace. Her complexion was very fair, with the rosy glow of vigorous health in the cheeks. Her face was full of character and expression. Her eyes were brown and liquid, and she had a heavy suit of fine, soft hair, which was also brown. But the fact was not apparent because her head was bound about with a checkered handkerchief, and the hair was concealed under it. Her face was shapely, intelligent, and comely, even beautiful. And so even if Roxy's blackness is not visible, it's audible, rather continually legible in Twain's text. And the dialect by which Twain marks Roxy's speech sets her apart from other potentially tragic mixed-race heroines, most of whom do not speak in dialect in the 19th century and display the kind of privileges of white ancestry via education and speech. But unlike Roxy, many of her predecessors in both white and black authored literature, they speak standard English, a sign in that racist tradition of moderate abolitionism, assumes that they might perhaps be more suitable for racial uplift after slavery than their uneducated or illiterate or visibly darker counterparts. But Twain undercuts that, I think, in this in a little bit. So Roxy's speech is a continual reminder to the reader of her enslavement, and later, when she is freed, of her social immobility. Roxy cannot pass for white. And this speech, like all dialect, doesn't become legible on its own, but only in relationship to other characters. Roxy's 1/16 of blackness, then, is visible not in her person, but her performance of race, in the racialized performance with which Twain imbues her speech. Her very fair complexion, the rosy glow of vigorous health in her cheeks and the fine soft hair, do not reveal biological traits of blackness, nor do her majestic form or stature, her imposing and statuesque attitudes, or noble and stately grace fit with the racist tropes that prioritize white standards of beauty. On the contrary, Roxy is described as shapely, intelligent, and comely and beautiful, not like most black women are described in texts by white authors, setting her apart from the established stereotype of the mammy. In addition to her appearance, Roxy's performance of race is specifically coded as a relation, both to legally white people, her enslavers, but also to her fellow enslaved companions. Twain writes, she had an easy, independent carriage when she was among her own caste, in a high and sassy way with all, but of course she was meek and humble enough where white people were. So Roxy's racial performance is not simply one of black subordination. Her visible whiteness makes Roxy subject to the same colorist prejudices by which she views herself in closer proximity to white gentility than to darker-skinned enslaved people on the plantation. The first conversation of hers that we read reveals her ideas about racist colorist hierarchies. And while her and Jasper's, who is the darker man that you see here, dialect looks very similar in Twain's text, this conversation reveals Roxy's colorist racism. The fact that Roxy says she's got something better to do than associate with ends as black as Jasper is, she says, is later revealed to be her supposed preference for white men, as one of high birth, the father of her son. Barbara Chellis argues that in this, Roxy, quote, accepts the class structure as completely as any other white member of the Dawson's Landing community. And this assertion merits more closely examining the extent to which Roxy, by virtue of her dual role as mammy and mother, is alternately empowered and disempowered in her struggle against these racial hierarchies. The status of Roxy and Essex's child, a familiar trope in the narrative of enslaved women's reproduction, remember, children follow the condition of their mother, regardless of who their father is, illustrates the limitations of white male racial genealogies. And so when it comes to enslavement, only maternity matters. Leslie Fiedler writes that, quote, if the fathers of the South are Virginia gentlemen, the mothers are the Negro girls, casualously or callously taken in the parody of love, which is all that is possible when one partner to a sexual union is not given the status of a person. But if we regard Roxy's feelings towards Essex as a parody of love, it's suggested by the fact that Roxy's apparent pride in her child's paternity by a first family of Virginia of formidable caliber, she says, this is still far from a legal claim. However, Roxy feels about her child's father, he has no legal relationship to this child. The revelation of paternity her son does him no material good. And although she is visually white, Roxy's status as enslaved also renders this child enslaved, a person who is socially and legally fatherless. Moreover, while Chellis gives Roxy every amount of agency in her union with this man, she also fails to acknowledge that Roxy's blood has already been mingled. So Roxy herself is also already a mixed race person. Her racial genealogy is already complicated by these contradictions. And by switching the assumedly white Thomas of Becket Driscoll and the black, though also visually white, Tom, and white is both Tom and herself, valet de chambre, Roxy usurps the family hierarchy and racial essentialism by which one child is heir to the father's estate, and the other, though his father is also a first family of Virginian, can claim, at which the whim of one child's father might be sold down the river. So in this act of switching her enslaver's child for her own, Roxy is a reversal of a type. Though Roxy's agency within this system of enslavement needs to be questioned. Her efforts are ultimately reversed. in true tragic form, concluding with just what our heroine attempted to prevent. If it is Roxy's own biological son at the end of this novel who is sold down the river at the story's conclusion. She does not effectively prevent what she tries to. And one possible assumption here is that these essentialist notions of race are restored at the story's close. We find out who is really black and who is really white. But Twain calls this fiction of race too into question, exposing this process of racialization in general as arbitrary, but also something in which Roxy takes a central role. Affecting the children's re-racialization, we can view Roxy's actions in light of their potential resistance to the hierarchy that makes one child her enslaver. And in this respect, she does work against this iconic trope of the mammy. Rather than give an ethical evaluation of how this Roxy works this plantation system, this is all, I think, a little bit dicey ethics here, we could examine how Roxy's unique place within that system, both as mammy and mother, allows her to navigate it. So ironically, it's in her capacity as a victim of slavery, racialized by the rules of matrilineal and hypodescent, that Roxy has the power to re-racialize these children. It is only because she is the mammy, because she is the caregiver, that she is able to do this. And in doing so, Roxy contributes not only to the construction of blackness, the blackness of her own child, but also to the construction of whiteness. In her capacity as both mother and mammy, she's the only caregiver who recognizes these children enough to make this switch. And it is through her performance of these racial relations to these children that affect the children's re-racialization. So as Roxy switches the almost identical babies, we are spiraled into this racial fiction that Roxy has created. Twain presents notions of socially constructed race against these assumptions of essentialism. Once she has exchanged these children's places simply by changing their clothes, we see her practice performing her corresponding mother and mammy roles with relation to them. She got up lighthearted and happy and went to the cradles and spent what was left of that night practicing. She would give her own child a light pat and say humbly, "Lay still, Marse Tom," and then give the real Tom a pat and say with severity, "Lay still, Chambers. Don't you want me to take something to you?" And as she progressed with the practice, she was surprised to see how steadily and surely the awe which had kept her tongue reverent and her manner humble towards her younger master was transferring itself to her speech and manner towards the usurper, and how similarly handy she was becoming in transferring her motherly curtness of speech and peremptoriness of manner to the unlucky heir of the ancient house of Driscoll. As we can see in this Century Illustrated magazine illustration of the scene, this performance that Roxy enacts to each child, the baby switching scene, determines not only their racialization, but their perceived relationships. One child becomes white and the other black, not because of genealogy, not because of how they look, not because of their identification, but because Roxy is placing them and herself into these racializing relations. Regarding the children's physical likeness to one another and understanding race as socially constructed, real as it is, Roxy correctly surmises that race requires that each child learn the intricacies of racial identity and performance, both with relation to one another and to her, their respective mother or mammy. And because the boys are only still infants, she easily teaches them to assume these newly assigned roles. The act that sparks the main plot of Pudd'nhead Wilson distinguishes her from more typical representations of the mammy figure by simultaneously representing her own motherhood. And unlike dark-skinned mammies typical to the figure's depiction throughout the 19th and 20th century, this and other illustrations of the novel show the difficulty of relating Roxy to either child based on visual cues alone. Like in this illustration, as in many of the earlier illustrations, you can't really tell which child is which either. I think we're not meant to. And so her ability to switch these boys is oddly dependent upon her son's ability to pass as white, and also on her own passing skin privilege. Reading Roxy as Twain's reversal of the satire of the mammy is appropriate not only for this upsetting of stereotype, but in the importance of Roxy's prioritization of her own child over that of her enslaver. And in this respect, I think most emphatically, Roxy rejects the role of the mammy for that of the mother, though admittedly in a more complicated way. The agency that Roxy is given here is a result not of her motherhood or of any privilege of her relative whiteness, but about this dual station of mammy and mother. And she alone is in this position to be able to make that switch. And importantly, her feelings of love and kinship towards her own son are the thing that prompt her to enact that switch in the first place. We see Roxy's motherly pride in an early scene in Pudd'nhead Wilson in which she compliments both children. In which Pudd'nhead Wilson, the character, compliments both of the children in Roxy's charge. They're handsome little chaps. One's just as handsome as the other, Wilson tells her. And she responds, "Bless your soul, Mr. Wilson. It's powerful nice of you to say that, 'cause one of them ain't nothing but an N. Mighty prime little N, I always says, but that's 'cause it's mine, of course." Though Roxy feels motherly love towards her biological son, she acknowledges this social hierarchy and performs this role of mammy in front of Pudd'nhead Wilson. But still, her love for her own son is not in spite of his race, but because of it, because he is her own, she says. And the precarious condition that he has inherited marks his race, but also his need for motherly love and protection. That need for which Twain's white characters, even Chambers' own white relations, are unlikely to give. And although Roxy is undoubtedly already familiar with the precariousness of slavery in the story's opening, she becomes alarmed when she fully realizes that her child is also in this precarious position. Her child could grow up and be sold down the river. The thought crazed her with horror, we read. So Roxy's baby switching recalls both that horror and her earlier abandoned plan for saving her son. So she discusses contemplating suicide and infanticide. And she initially tells Chambers, "Come along, honey. Come along with Mammy, and we're going to jump in the river. Then the troubles of this world is all over. They don't sell poor ends down the river over yonder." Margaret Garner, who in 1856 famously killed her own child to avoid being returned to slavery, illustrates the realism of this option that Roxy considers. Infanticide is no mere plot device, but reveals a historical consideration, particularly when we take the Christian promise of heaven seriously, that enslaved people sometimes viewed death as better than enslavement. And to kill herself in order to send and accompany her child to heaven is the first act of mother love that Roxy contemplates before she decides to switch the children. And put simply, Roxy's available choices are limited. Enslaved mothers are often denied the ability to perform the protective duties of motherhood because of the system that denied enslaved people both freedom of action and access to kin from whom they were likely to be separated by either sale or death. So the power that Roxy grasps is interesting in its ability to racialize, a power most often discussed and imposed upon Black mothers who pass their race down along with their enslaved status, rather than the power that they might use in their own active construction of relative racializations. But Roxy's power extends to racializing not only her own offspring, but also her enslavers. The enslaved mother functions in opposition to the privileged and protected place afforded to white feminine motherhood. Switching her child with that of her enslaver, Roxy collapses this mammy-mother dyad and moves between and melds these roles in her relation to Tom and Chambers. She cannot change roles completely, though, as the reader is always aware of the true nature of her maternal relations, but her actions in these roles propel the novel's plot. And the agency that Roxy is afforded by this collapse is, of course, short-lived, as she performs that role of mammy in relation to her own son. While feelings of biological kinship drive Roxy to switch the babies, her behavior of both kinship and racial relations keeps these children in their places. So the boys grow up, and Roxy raises them in accordance with these new relations of race and kinship, relative to herself, with predictable results. Her son becomes the haughty young man who believes he will be the future enslaver of the plantation. And the enslaver's child becomes a man who anticipates his own lifelong enslavement. The relationship between Roxy and her biological son is, until this revelation of his true identity, no longer a mother-child relation, but one of mammy and enslaver. And this is perhaps the clearest marker of Roxy's construction, not only of blackness, but also of whiteness. Twain collapses the relation between mother and mammy in the text, as we read further about Roxy's adoption of the role of mammy to her own child. He was her darling, her master, her deity all in one, and in her worship of him, she forgot who she was and what he had been. The narrative almost forgets this too, and this is where Twain's novel gets really tricky and really kind of difficult, deliberately difficult to read. The problem of referring to the two boys presents a problem for the omniscient narrator, whose reader is in on the secret, so to speak, but whose characters remain ignorant of Roxy's switch. At the outset, Roxy's performance of both mother and mammy in forming the children's newly racialized roles is enacted by Twain's narrator, who acknowledges this problem in naming the children. And the problem of naming is initially solved in an early chapter. Twain writes, "The history must henceforth accommodate itself to the change which Roxana had consummated, and call the real heir Chambers and the usurping little slave Thomas à Becket, shortening this latter name to Tom for daily use as the people about him did." And so, as this history correspondingly switches the boys' names to reflect their assumed roles rather than their original identities, Twain's narrator is willing to maintain this performance of identity, just as Roxy does, and as the children who don't initially know that they have been re-racialized do. The switch of re-racialization that Roxy enacts is so convincing then that even the narration must acknowledge it. And this acknowledgement evidences the efficacy of Roxy's racial construction. But what Roxy sacrifices in this reassignment of identities is any effective attachment that she might elicit from her own son. While Roxy's relationship with the young man now known as Chambers is seldom shown in Twain's novel, we see her relationship with Tom degraded from one of child and mother to that of enslaver and enslaved. And in the story's most disturbing scenes, we see Tom beat Roxy, who readers know is his biological mother. Ultimately, he sells her down the river, just as she is enacting yet another motherly sacrifice by offering herself up to be sold, although she had been legally gained her freedom by this point in the story, in order to preserve his white inheritance. What might be most disturbing about these scenes is that they may not elicit the same horror from some readers, were it not for our knowledge of Roxy's biological relation to the grown man, now known as Tom. If Roxy cannot get Tom's affection by appealing to his affection as his mammy, she then tries to get it by blackmailing him with the truth, by telling him that she is his biological mother. Roxy's position as mother might be viewed not simply as another imitation of the enslaver, but as an enactment of the racializing relations inherent in the mother and mammy. As the white matrons are rather quickly dispensed of and pushed to the fringes of Twain's story, there are virtually no white women in this novel. We almost forget that Aunt Pratt is a character who is alive until she sends a telegram informing Tom of his uncle's death. But with no living biological mother, Tom's only maternal figure is his enslaved mammy. And even in conversation with Chambers, does Roxy prioritize her relationship with this other boy, invoking her position as Tom's mammy, but without revealing to the man who believes himself to be her son the truth about his birth. And so it is in this role as mammy, interestingly, and not just as mother, that Roxy presents herself as someone who has a right to know the details of Tom's business. She asks, "Was I his mother till he was 15 years old, or wasn't I?" However, when Roxy initially attempts to gain Tom's sympathy by virtue of her position as mammy, she fails, and it's only after he recognizes her position as biological mother that he submits to the role of a dutiful child. The confusing identities of the two boys, their confusing racialized relations to Roxy, continues to present a problem for the narration's representation of the text's kinship relations, even after this convenient name change that Twain enacts early in the novel. So while still calling the original Chambers Tom, even after he knows the fact of his birth, the text now refers to Roxy as his mother. And so these two moves, the naming of him as Tom and the naming of the kinship relation as his mother, should logically be mutually exclusive in the text, but Twain leaves them there in this conflict. The fact that they are not mutually exclusive acknowledges this conflation of the mother and mammy roles that Roxy simultaneously, not just alternatively, performs. These are all mixed up now. The excesses of names and relations in the text is too much for the narration itself to support. And in this way, Twain's deliberately contradictory narration of Pudd'nhead Wilson's relationships represents this difficulty of dealing with the overabundance of names and identities held in Roxy's role as mother and mammy. And as Tom continues to call Roxy by the more ambiguous appellation, mammy, we see how enslaved motherhood, even when recognized, is never completely free of that role of mammy. Thus, even in having his mother revealed to him, Tom remains somehow motherless under the system of slavery. So from this complex relationship between Tom and Roxy, a reader might expect an equally complex parallel in Roxy's relationship to Chambers, who is the biological son of Roxy's enslaver, but raised as her son. The rather conspicuous disappearance and reappearance of Chambers is one of the text's many oddities. By switching the babies, Roxy attempts to privilege her own son while condemning her enslaver's heir to slavery. But whatever mother-child relationship the new Chambers might have gained as a result of this switch is somehow lost. As Roxy disinherits Tom Driscoll, she does so twice, by also disinheriting the child who believes her to be his mother from that kinship relation. An extension of this discussion might take into account the presence or absence of Chambers in this story, in his partially articulated kinship relations to both Roxy and Tom, as well as in his final position as a white man who was raised black and enslaved via Twain's revision of the tragic mixed-race hero trope that renders more complex because Roxy herself doesn't really fit neatly into this role, and so Chambers, the new Chambers is the one who fits into that tragic role. And we read at the conclusion that he, restored to freedom and the inheritance of whiteness, quote, continued his father's heir's pension for $35 a month to Roxy. And this financial support of his mammy or mother is an indication that Chambers does not abandon the affection for the woman that he thought was his mother and raises questions about his ability to assume the white supremacist role that would make her his mammy. But Twain's story does not prioritize these kinship relations. He turns to the science of individualism rather than of race to restore the identities of Valet de Chambre and Thomas Driscoll at the end of the book. In Pudd'nhead Wilson's courtroom evidence of the children's fingerprints, the question of racial identity becomes one of name and of individual identity and continuity, but importantly not one of race or kinship. Neither man is ever proven to be white or black by this evidence, nor is Roxy's maternity clearly identified, but rather the altered fingerprint records alone indicate that a change has been made. Roxy is identified not maternally but circumstantially as the only person who is in a position to have been able to switch the children. Fingerprinting stands as a science of individual identity against popular theories of scientific racism by which racists imagined black people and other people of color to be inferior. And the courtroom drama ending of Pudd'nhead Wilson is essential. The detective story plot is not really separable from the racial melodrama of the story. But David Pudd'nhead Wilson is, the title character after all. Perhaps what makes the tale so tragic is how close to Pudd'nhead Wilson, who might understand the implications of the justice that he enacts, brings to remaining a farce rather than a tragedy. Twain's ambiguous ending has Tom, Roxy's biological child, sold down the river as punishment for his crimes, and restores Chambers to his original position as white enslaver. Tom's story proves equally as tragic as Chambers' inability to fit into either white or black society and falls short of condemning the system of Southern plantation slavery. When Pudd'nhead Wilson is the person that Twain's tale is ostensibly about, Roxy is shifted to the background, oddly, I think, of many, many discussions of the novel. But as Roxy is the novel's central parental figure, we might rather imagine a fraternal relationship of sorts between Tom and Chambers as well, triangulated through the relationship to her, or as 19th century topsy-turvy dolls Not simply two sides of the same coin, though. The boys and their racial relationship to one another are extended through Roxy. And we can see, I think, that through this, their relationship a bit more in this late 20th century Bantam cover illustration. And while Tom stands confidently with his back to Roxy's skirt, Chambers peeks around from behind, seemingly unsure of his place in this racial narrative, as Twain's readers must be. In addition to Tom and Chambers' pairing, the pairing of Pudd'nhead and Roxy present parents with different relations to Tom and Chambers' genealogy. Even though divorced from taxonomies of race, the science of fingerprinting traces these men's original identities and provides them with some genealogy of sorts. Their racialization is not a matter of science, but remains a fiction of social agreement, an agreement that the mammy or mother was in a position to revise. Oops. Nope, not yet. So departing from contemporary literary renditions of Black motherhood by African American authors, Roxy doesn't really have the means to create a loving kinship relationship with her own biological son, which seems to have been irrevocably tainted by the system of plantation slavery that is painted as equally harmful to the characters of both enslavers and the enslaved. And the story's odd restoration of Tom to his supposed rightful position of enslavement and the relegation of Chambers to the unhappy liminality reserved for racial ambiguity leaves no family for Roxy to preside over. In Pudd'nhead Wilson's tragic conclusion, essential and legal categories of race and kinship override Roxy's enactment of maternity, and Twain leaves her biological son and hence her own motherhood without a clear place at the end of the novel. So I want to close my talk today with another figure of the mammy mother, Joyce Scott's 1991 sculpture, No Mommy Me, which shows a Black child displaced from their mother's care as she tends to, or perhaps contends with, a white child. And here we find the Black mother physically positioned in competing racialized relations of caregiving to white and Black children. The Black child clings closely to his mother's skirt as she holds the white child with arms outstretched, as though symbolically distancing him from her. The worry of the Black child in Scott's sculpture seems to be that the mother's attention is directed towards the white child and away from her own child. The concern is that the Black child will be neglected, either by the mother, but by the structure of power that governs these relations of racialized maternal care that would cause her to prioritize one child over the other. And like Twain's novel, Scott's sculpture represents the mammy as not alternating between these roles of mother and mammy, but positioned between them. Recalling the mammy's role as wet nurse, the Black child's presence is never simply an alternative to their mother role as caregiver to the white child. Never simply an alternative to their mother's role as caregiver to the white child, but prefigures it, as the latter depends upon the former. Mother and mammy converge. Juxtaposed alongside the illustration of Twain's novel, we might consider Roxy simultaneously mother and mammy to the same children. The comparison illustrates how we can't divorce that figure of the mammy from this dual intertwined relationship with motherhood. Instead, we see how motherhood underlies the mammy's racial genealogies.